The question of certainty. You begin with a question that seems simple at first. How do you know that what you call knowledge is reliable? The mind relies on its own operations to confirm itself. Yet this very self-verification raises the doubt Al-Ghazali confronted early in his inquiry. If the mind trusts its reasoning because reasoning appears convincing, is that trust evidence or habit? You notice the fragility of conclusions resting on instruments that cannot step outside themselves. This does not diminish reason. It simply exposes its circular structure. You are left wondering whether certainty can arise from within the same framework that produces uncertainty. The question unsettles the assumption that understanding guarantees truth, and you end here with an unresolved inquiry. If the mind is both judge and defendant, who evaluates the judgment? The world of Al-Ghazali. In 11th century Baghdad, Al-Ghazali lived among scholars who argued with precision and confidence. Rationalists debated metaphysicians. Theologians challenged philosophers. Mystics examined consciousness itself. The intellectual life of the city thrived on inquiry, but its intensity also revealed the instability beneath its claims. Each school asserted the reliability of its method, yet none could escape the question of whether any method could guarantee truth. In this environment, Al-Ghazali did not reject knowledge. He confronted its assumptions, and the section ends with a quiet question. When so many voices claim certainty, does abundance clarify truth or obscure it? The crisis of knowledge. You now enter the space where Al-Ghazali recognized that every source of certainty contains its own weakness. Sensory perception changes under different conditions. Rational arguments contradict one another, while appearing equally logical. Inherited beliefs depend on unexamined trust, rather than direct verification. As you consider this, the ground of understanding feels less stable. It is not despair, but clarity that emerges. The mind can be deceived by its own conviction. The question that follows is simple but decisive. If all forms of knowledge can be doubted, what remains untouched by doubt? The section leaves you with this unresolved tension. Does the collapse of certainty destroy truth or point beyond the collapse itself? The limits of reason. Al-Ghazali does not attack reason. He observes its structure. Reason can analyze, compare, distinguish, and refine. Yet it cannot prove the legitimacy of its own authority without presupposing that authority. You begin to see the circularity. Every rational proof requires a rational standard, and that standard cannot validate itself without infinite regression. This recognition is not emotional. It is simply the logical boundary of reason's domain. You are left to consider whether the highest truths exceed the tool used to investigate them. If a scale cannot weigh its own capacity, can reason verify the reliability of reason? That question remains open, and the section closes without resolving it. The mirror of the heart. After tracing the limits of intellectual method, Al-Ghazali turns to the inner faculty he calls the heart, not as emotion, but as the seat of direct awareness. He observes that the clarity of knowledge depends on the clarity of the knower. You are asked to notice how desire, bias, and self-interest shape what seems obvious. When the mind wants a conclusion to be true, it strengthens arguments that support it and weakens those that oppose it. This is not deception by external forces. It is the structure of the self-influencing perception. You begin to see that purification of the knower is as critical as examination of the known, and you are left with a question. If the heart is the mirror of truth, what polishes the mirror? The seeker's doubt. For Al-Ghazali, doubt becomes a discipline rather than a disturbance. You are invited to explore. Doubt not as skepticism that destroys meaning, but as a method that tests the validity of inherited assumptions. When you examine a belief without defending it, the belief reveals its strength or weakness naturally. Doubt becomes a clearing process, making room for understanding that is not shaped by imitation or habit. In this way, certainty is not handed down but earned through direct confrontation with confusion. You are left at the edge of a simple question. If doubt strips away the unreliable, what remains when everything uncertain has been removed? The light of understanding. Al-Ghazali concludes that true certainty does not arise from argument but from transformation of the inner state. You begin to see that clarity appears when the mind becomes capable of recognizing truth directly, without needing constant verification. This is not intuition in the emotional sense, nor is it intellectual deduction. It is a stable awareness in which contradictions fall away because the observer is no longer divided within himself. The insight emerges quietly. Understanding is not constructed. It is revealed, and the section ends with a question that cannot be answered by reasoning alone. If understanding is illumination, why does the mind need such long preparation to perceive what is self? The invisible presence at this point. The discussion interlaces Al-Ghazali's inquiry with Al-Ghazali's notion of the hidden presence, not as metaphor, but as an analytical observation. Al-Ghazali suggests that the unseen conditions, the seen. Al-Ghazali observes that awareness underlies every thought, perception, and judgment. The alignment between these insights becomes clear. Everything you perceive changes, but the fact of perception remains constant. Thoughts come and go. The awareness of thinking persists. Intellectual positions shift. The knowing of those positions stays stable. Even the sense of self fluctuates. Yet the immediate recognition of those fluctuations does not. You are invited to reflect on whether this unchanging awareness is the invisible through which all changing phenomena become intelligible. It is invisible not because it is hidden, but because it is so fundamental that the mind overlooks it. When you look outward, you see objects. When you look inward, you see thoughts, but the seeing itself remains unnoticed. This presence is not mystical in a poetic sense. It is a logical requirement for any experience to appear at all without awareness. No perception could arise without awareness. Doubt could not be recognized without awareness. Certainty would not register. Both Al-Ghazali and Al-Ghazali point, each in their own language, to this ground of knowing. The section ends with a question that remains open. If the invisible makes all things knowable, is it truly invisible, or only overlooked because it is never absent? Reconciling reason and presence. Having examined the limits of reason and the stability of presence, you now consider how Al-Ghazali integrates the two. He does not discard reason. He places it in its proper order. Reason tests, clarifies, distinguishes, and examines. It prevents misinterpretation and guards against confusion, but it cannot provide the foundation upon which certainty rests. That foundation comes from the immediate clarity of awareness, the recognition that before thought analyzes truth, presence reveals it. You observe that this reconciliation offers a balanced path. Reason becomes precise when it operates within awareness rather than in isolation. When thought arises against a background of clarity, it does not distort itself through bias, fear, or self-interest. You can examine ideas without the urgency to defend them. You can revise conclusions without destabilizing your sense of self. Reason becomes a tool used by awareness, not a sovereign authority claiming independent power. This integration resolves the tension between logical inquiry and inner realization, investigates the structures of the world's presence, reveals the ground upon which investigation occurs. You are left with a challenge that cannot be answered conclusively. If reason depends on presence, can presence ever be fully understood through reason? The return to the world, after finding clarity within, Al-Ghazali returns to public life, teaching and advising with a perspective shaped by awareness rather than intellectual ambition. For you, this becomes an invitation to notice how inner clarity influences outward action. When thought arises from presence rather than from habit, it becomes measured and reliable. You do not seek validation or victory. You simply respond to what is true. This return is not a withdrawal from the world, but a reorientation within it. You still reason, analyze, and decide. But these processes no longer attempt to ground themselves. They operate within the stability of awareness, and therefore they remain flexible without becoming uncertain. The section leaves you with an open inquiry. Does clarity change the world? Or does it only change the way you perceive the world? The dissolution of the seeker as presence becomes more evident. The distinction between seeker and sought begins to dissolve. You notice that the movement toward truth was possible only because truth was already accessible as awareness itself. The seeker assumes distance. Presence reveals no distance, thought continues. But the compulsion to claim knowledge weakens. You begin to recognize that the desire to possess truth was sustained by an imagined separation between yourself and understanding. When that separation dissolves, the question arises, if the seeker disappears, what remains to receive truth? The section ends without resolving the paradox, the silence of knowing. You arrive at a point where reasoning has completed its role. The inquiry no longer seeks conclusions but notices the ground in which inquiry arises. Presence does not claim truth. It simply remains when thought becomes quiet. In this stillness, nothing is added and nothing is taken away. Certainty is not an object to attain, but the recognition of what is always here beneath every question. The mind does not stop functioning. It simply stops asserting. And so the script ends without closure, leaving only a final reflection that cannot be answered through thought. When thinking subsides, what is it that knows?